The battle for African sovereignty has entered a critical new phase with Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traore at its center. Since coming to power in September 2022, Captain Traore has become the focal point of Western opposition, facing an astonishing 20 assassination attempts. His crimes are daring to reclaim Burkina Faso's resources and sovereignty from Western control, particularly French neocolonial influence that has dominated the region for decades. The heart of this conflict lies in the notorious French colonial agreement established in 1958 by Charles de Gaulle as independence movements swept across Africa. This agreement, rarely discussed in Western media, effectively maintained economic colonization while creating the illusion of political independence. Under its terms, France maintained ownership of all natural resources in its former colonies, claimed 95% of national wealth, loaned money back to African nations at exploitative interest rates, and secured first rights to all government contracts. This arrangement ensured that countries like Burkina Faso remained financially dependent despite their nominal independence. Following in the footsteps of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader who was assassinated in 1987, Captain Traore has systematically dismantled this neocolonial structure. He has reclaimed ownership of the country's gold mines, renegotiated exploitative contracts, invested heavily in agriculture to ensure food sovereignty, and is building a gold refinery so that Burkina Faso can process its own resources rather than exporting raw materials for Western profit. Further, Captain Traore has rejected financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, insisting that the country can develop without the loans and its conditionalities from the West. To many Africans, this gesture is not just a financial decision but the determination to break away from the shackles of the Bretton Woods institutions, which has often been criticized for imposing austerity measures that have weakened many African economies. These actions taken by Captain Traore represent a direct challenge to the established order that has kept Africa's wealth flowing northward for centuries. The Western response has followed a familiar playbook. Just as past leaders like Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, and Muammar Gaddafi faced destabilization and elimination when they threatened Western interests, Captain Traore now faces propaganda campaigns accusing him of corruption and dictatorship. Captain Ibrahim Traore became the world's youngest head of state in September 2022, when he and other junior military officers ousted interim President Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, who had also ascended to the presidency through a coup in January of the same year. During his tenure, Captain Traore has sought to distance the country from its former colonial power, France. His popularity has soared since his ascension to power, and he is now arguably Africa's most popular if not favorite president. He attracts a lot of attention and interest across Africa and beyond. He's particularly admired by young people who see him as a revolutionary leader. On January 7, 2025, during President Mahama's inauguration in Accra, Ghana, Captain Traore received the loudest applause among all the 21 African heads of state present. This was evidence of his popularity, but also reflected the worrisome increasing trend of tolerance for military rule on the continent, especially among the youth. Initially, he pledged to adhere to the transition timetable agreed with the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which aimed to restore democratic rule by July 2024. However, Burkina Faso has since withdrawn from ECOWAS, forming instead the alliance of Sahel states with Mali and Niger, countries also run by post-coup administrations. Under Burkina Faso's new transition plan, Captain Traore may remain in his position until at least 2029. On social media, Captain Traore has been referred to as Sankara incarnate. In this episode, we cover the unusual rise to power of Captain Ibrahim Traore, how he's becoming Africa's most loved and unapologetic leader, how he has become the focal point of Western opposition, facing an astonishing 20 assassination attempts, and how he has managed to survive all. However, in order to understand Captain Traore's actions, you first need to understand the country he comes from. Burkina Faso, formerly known as Upper Volta, was under French occupation for approximately 64 years from 1896 to 1960. The French colonial period in Burkina Faso began in 1896 when France invaded the territory and established it as a French protectorate. By 1898, most of the area corresponding to present-day Burkina Faso had been conquered by French forces. French Upper Volta was formally established in 1919 as a separate colony within French West Africa. the French colonial administration imposed forced labor on the local population, which was met with significant resistance. This included refusal to work and attempts to escape the harsh conditions. In 1932, the colony was dissolved and its territory divided among neighboring French colonies, but was later re-established in 1947. The local population of Burkina Faso, then known as Upper Volta, resisted French colonization through various means, including armed uprisings, political movements, and cultural preservation efforts. In 1958, Upper Volta became a self-governing colony within the French community, and in 1960, the country gained its full independence from France, with Maurice Yameogo as its first president. Since gaining independence, the country has been subject to instability, droughts, famines, and corruption. There have also been various successful coups in 1966, 1980, 1982, 1983, 1987, and twice in 2022. There have also been several unsuccessful coups, with at least a dozen. Despite independence, Burkina Faso maintained strong ties with France, including participation in the CFA Franc Zone and the Francophonie organization. Soon after coming to power, Yameogo banned all political parties other than his own party. The government lasted until 1966. After much unrest, including mass demonstrations and strikes by students, labor unions, and civil servants, the military intervened. Yameogo was deposed in a coup in 1966 by Lieutenant Colonel Sangoule Lamizana, who suspended the constitution and dissolved the National Assembly. Lamizana's rule coincided with the beginning of the Sahel drought and famine, which had a devastating impact on Upper Volta and neighboring countries. Lamizana was overthrown in 1980 by Colonel Saye Zerbo. Colonel Zerbo also encountered resistance from trade unions and was overthrown 2 years later by Major Dr. Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo and the Council of Popular Salvation, CSP, in 1982. Infighting developed between the right and left factions of the CSP. The leader of the leftists, Captain Thomas Sankara, was appointed Prime Minister in January 1983, but was subsequently arrested. Efforts to free him, directed by Blaise Compaoré, resulted in a military coup in August 1983. The coup brought Sankara to power at just age 33, and his government began to implement a series of revolutionary programs, which included mass vaccinations, infrastructure improvements, the expansion of women's rights, encouragement of domestic agricultural consumption, and anti-desertification projects. In 1984, Sankara changed the country's name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning the land of the upright people. Sankara launched an ambitious socio-economic program for change, one of the largest ever undertaken on the African continent. His foreign policies centered on anti-imperialism, with his government rejecting all foreign aid, pushing for odious debt reduction, nationalizing all land and mineral wealth, and averting the power and influence of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank. His domestic policies included a nationwide literacy campaign, land redistribution to peasants, railway and road construction, and the outlawing of female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy. On 15th of October 1987, Sankara and 12 other government officials were assassinated in a France-backed coup organized by Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's closest ally, who took over as Burkina Faso's president. He held the position until October 2014. Compaoré gave the deterioration in relations with neighboring countries as one of the reasons for the coup. He argued that Sankara had jeopardized foreign relations with the former colonial power, France, and with neighboring Ivory Coast. Following the coup, Compaoré immediately reversed the nationalizations, overturned nearly all of Sankara's policies, returned the country back into the IMF fold, and ultimately spurned most of Sankara's legacy. Blaise Compaoré went on to rule for 27 years before being ousted in a popular uprising in 2014, after attempting to amend the constitution to extend his 27-year term. A jihadist insurgency linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group began in August 2015, part of the Islamist insurgency in the Sahel also affecting Niger and Mali. The insurgency began with an attack on a gendarmerie by alleged Boko Haram members. Since 2016, the number of attacks has significantly increased, particularly after the founding of Ansarul Islam and the emergence of Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS. General elections were held in November 2015. Roch Kabore won the election, and in the country's first peaceful transition of power, Roch Kabore became president and was re-elected in the general election of November 2020. Upon taking power in 2015, Kabore became the first non-interim president in 49 years without any past ties to the military. The period between 2016 and 2021 proved to be the most democratic in Burkina Faso's history. Kabore pledged to make the fight against jihadists a priority. However, the security situation in the country continues to worsen with an escalating jihadist attacks. Between 2015 and 2018, terrorist attacks targeted the capital Ouagadougou and other centers of power. An accord was signed that allowed French troops to conduct counter-terrorism operations in Burkina Faso. Mass protests broke out across the country in November 2021 over the jihadist violence. Several protesters asked for the resignation of President Roch Kabore. In response, the following month, President Kabore ordered a military reshuffle and his prime minister's resignation. But it was too little. In January 2022, Kabore fell to a military coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, the former counter-terrorism commander in the north. With the Islamist insurgency continuing to spiral, however, and Damiba resisting demands to end French counter-terrorism assistance, Lieutenant Colonel Damiba was himself ousted 8 months later by another coup. Notably, the September 2022 coup was welcomed with pro-coup rallies and anti-French protests. The coup brought to power the man himself, Captain Ibrahim Traore. Ibrahim Traore was born on March 14, 1988 in Bondokui, a small town on the route connecting Burkina Faso's second city Bobo-Dioulasso and its fourth largest Ouahigouya. After receiving his primary education in Bondokui, he completed secondary school in Bobo-Dioulasso, where he was known as being quiet, shy, and very talented and intelligent. After completing his secondary education in Bobo-Dioulasso, he then moved to the nation's capital in 2006, where he studied geology at the University of Ouagadougou. After this, Traore settled on a military career and joined the army of Burkina Faso in 2009 at the age of 21. He undertook his officer training at the Georges Namoano Military Academy, an officer school for the Burkinabe Armed Forces. He acquired artillery skills in the North African nation of Morocco. He graduated as a second lieutenant in 2012 and served as a peacekeeper in the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission to Mali, MINUSMA, after being promoted to lieutenant in 2014. His major breakthrough came when he was deployed to Mali. He was cited as one of the MINUSMA soldiers who showed courage and bravery during major rebel attacks. Aged 26 at the time, Traore overcame a complex attack by militant extremists in the northern Timbuktu region of Mali. Traore, who was a lieutenant at the time, exhibited leadership attributes including being willful, courageous, and close to his men. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso has been locked in a deadly conflict with Islamist militants since 2015. After his time with MINUSMA, he subsequently returned to his native Burkina Faso, where he took part in operations against the escalating jihadist insurgency between 2019 and 2022. Traore fought in several other counterinsurgency operations in the country's north. He was promoted to captain in 2020 at the age of 32. Traore later said that he became disillusioned with his country's leadership around this time, as he saw the widespread lack of equipment of Burkinabe soldiers, while politicians were handing out suitcases of money for bribery. He gradually became the spokesman for soldiers stationed in the north who were frustrated over their government. The lack of military equipment and logistics caused discontent among the military ranks, members of which criticized the government's lack of effort combating jihadist groups. The then civilian government of President Roch Kabore faced regular protests due to the handling of the ongoing jihadi crisis in the country. Several protesters asked for the resignation of President Kabore, who had been in power since 2015 after being re-elected in 2020. Despite several protests, the situation remained largely unchanged with an escalating security crisis. By late 2021, close to 3,000 people have been killed and close to 2 million people have been displaced. Faced with these unbearable circumstances, the military staged a coup in January 2022. Captain Traore was part of a group of army officers that took part in the coup against then-civilian President Roch Kabore. The coup brought Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba to power as head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration. Lieutenant Colonel Damiba cited President Kabore's inability to quell the Islamist insurgency. Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba was well known for his widely popular military operations against Islamists. Damiba then assigned Captain Traore as chief of an artillery regiment in the north-central region of Burkina Faso. Damiba pledged to improve security and eventually restore civilian rule. However, the military regime failed to defeat the jihadists. Instead, rebels and other non-state actors even expanded their operations and controlled 40% of the country by September 2022. Many military officers grew dissatisfied with Damiba, believing that he did not focus on the rebellion. Jihadist insurgents launched several major attacks in September 2022, causing Damiba to reshuffle his cabinet. Many supporters of the January coup became dissatisfied with the performance of Paul-Henri Damiba regarding his inability to contain the jihadist insurgency. The dissatisfaction about the situation was highest among younger officers who fought against the rebels at the front lines. In addition, there were delays in pay for the Cobra troops. In addition, Lieutenant Colonel Damiba was also criticized for seemingly taking a more pro-France stance in working together with the former colonizer to root out armed groups, as anti-France sentiment has risen in their former colonies. On September 5, 2022, at least 35 civilians were killed and 37 wounded following a suspected jihadist attack when a vehicle in an escorted supply convoy heading to Ouagadougou was struck by an improvised explosive device on the main road between the northern towns of Djibo and Bourzanga in the north of Burkina Faso. Again, on September 26, 2022, a supply convoy of about 150 trucks escorted by the army traveling to the besieged northern town of Djibo was ambushed by militants, leading to the death of 27 Burkinabe soldiers and 10 civilians. This event further undermined public confidence in Damiba's government. Many frontline officers were disgruntled about Damiba's handling of the jihadist insurgency. As it became clear that Lieutenant Colonel Damiba was losing popularity within the junta, Captain Traore and a group of junior officers organized a coup. In the morning of September 30, 2022, heavy gunfire and explosions were heard in several parts of the capital Ouagadougou, including in the neighborhood that houses both the presidential and military junta headquarters. Masked soldiers organized blockades in the capital's center. They seized on public and military outrage around an ambush that left 11 soldiers and dozens of civilians dead. As civilians realized that a coup was taking place, groups gathered in the capital to gather information or demonstrate support for the coup plotters. Justifying why they were removing Lieutenant Colonel Damiba from office, Captain Traore said in a televised address on October 1, 2022, that Lieutenant Colonel Damiba had failed to tackle the unending problem of insurgency. He dissolved the government, the Transitional Legislative Assembly, suspended the constitution, closed the borders, and declared a nightly curfew. In the direct aftermath of the coup, Captain Traore was chosen as the new head of the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, thereby overthrowing and replacing Lieutenant Colonel Damiba. On the 6th October, he also assumed the position of interim president as head of state and supreme head of the armed forces at just 34 years old. Shortly after the coup, Captain Traore acknowledged that his age would be a subject of discussion among those questioning his presidential credentials. In his inaugural statement, Captain Traore said Burkina Faso faced an emergency, citing crises in security, defense, healthcare, social action, and infrastructure. He pledged to combat terrorism and adhere to the transition timetable agreed with the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, which aimed to restore democratic rule by July 1, 2024. However, Burkina Faso has since withdrawn from ECOWAS, forming instead the Alliance of Sahel States with Mali and Niger, countries also run by post-coup administrations. Under Burkina Faso's new transition plan, Captain Traore may remain in his position until at least 2029. Since assuming power, Traore has positioned himself as a revolutionary figure using anti-colonial and pan-Africanist language, gaining inspiration from Burkina Faso's legendary former leader, Thomas Sankara. In fact, some media reports have even drawn comparisons between Traore and Thomas Sankara. More than just a presentation, Traore has demonstrated his anti-colonial sentiments. This has been done by nationalizing local wealth and expelling French soldiers from Burkina Faso, noting that they wish to tackle their security problem independently. In place of French partnerships, Traore has opted instead for Russian friendship. In his administration so far, these moves have gathered for him a very high unofficial approval rating, not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa and amongst Africans in diaspora. As mentioned earlier, Burkina Faso is aiming for more control over its resources, and as such, has changed its mining legislation, creating a new state mining corporation. This move immediately scored points with people who have been advocating for a pro-national government where the country's wealth is distributed primarily within its borders. Burkina Faso utilized its new state mining corporation to obtain control of 2 industrial gold mines, formerly controlled by a London-listed Endeavour Mining. In April 2025, Burkina Faso's military-led government granted an industrial mining license to a Russian company for a new gold project. Burkina Faso has been locked in a deadly conflict with Islamist militants since 2015, and as a result had called for international assistance to combat the issue. However, since taking power, Ibrahim Traore had expelled said foreign backers, noting that they had been very ineffective in dealing with the security challenge. In early 2023, the 400-member Operation Sabre, which was sent in 2009 to combat armed organizations such as Al-Qaeda in the area, was given a 1-month ultimatum to leave. This decision was made to create a self-sustaining security infrastructure, which so far has come with some drawbacks. 2024 alone saw the country suffer 5 of the most deadly terrorist attacks in Africa. Nevertheless, Traore insists on finding help outside of an institution that had historically colonized its people. Currently, Burkina Faso is looking at military cooperation with Russia, and negotiations are showing positive signs. This move works on several levels, especially considering that the people of Burkina Faso have welcomed the idea of a Russian partnership. The international shine on him appeared to have faded until July 2023, when he accompanied 16 other African heads of state to St. Petersburg in Russia for a meeting with President Vladimir Putin, who had organized the Russia-Africa Summit. His fellow presidents were dressed in their characteristic custom-tailored, expensive suits. But the towering Captain Traore, who is slightly above 6 feet in height, showed up in military combat clothing, complete with a red beret and tactical gloves. While walking past the security officers who were saluting the arriving heads of state at the summit's venue, Expo Forum, Traore was one of the few, if not the only visiting president who saluted back. If that did not appeal to the world's optics, his muscular physique and unique presence even in Putin's proximity did when he posed for a photograph with the Russian leader. The saluting, the picture with Putin and the dress code earned him the attention, but his speech during the Russia-Africa Summit held between July 27 and 28 earned him plaudits. He went ahead to blast African presidents who are happy to receive freebies. His remarks were likened to those made in the early 1980s by the revered Thomas Sankara, who, just like Traore, in an equally major international platform, the United Nations General Assembly. After his trip to Russia in July, Captain Ibrahim Traore received a grand welcome by thousands of Burkina Faso citizens who had lined up on the streets of the capital, Ouagadougou. The only African country Traore has visited outside the Alliance of Sahel States is Ghana, where he attended President John Mahama's inauguration on January 7, 2025. His popularity has soared since his ascension to power. At President John Mahama's inauguration in Ghana, Traore received the loudest applause of all 21 African heads of state. This showed not only his popularity but the trend of tolerance for military rule in Africa, especially among the youth. On that day, many social media users were introduced to the revolutionary leader, who had organically garnered the love of many Africans. Since then, it has been an accepted rhetoric on social media that Ibrahim Traore is one of the most pro-African heads of states in the modern era. Subsequently, Traore's popularity would peak after General Michael Langley, the head of the US military in Africa, declared publicly during a US congressional hearing that the Burkina Faso president had become a person of interest, who uses Burkina Faso's gold to shield himself.
Absolutely, Chairman. I see this, and I don't mind calling them out, but Captain Traore and Burkina Faso, as they know that both, whether it's their gold reserves, that is all those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime.
This, of course, did not bode well with young Africans who have begun to embrace him as the ideal image of a true African leader. And more than just a conversation online, people have taken to the streets to express their love and support for the man, calling for his protection. On April 30, 2025, large crowds of demonstrators gathered in Ouagadougou, Accra, Abuja, Kingston, London, Paris, Berlin, and many other cities, chanting "Long live Captain Traore." Some of them had banners that displayed a picture of General Langley with the word "slave" scrawled in red marker on his head. Others carried the flags of Russia, a key friend of Burkina Faso. These demonstrations sent a clear message that Africans recognize the historical pattern and will not tolerate another assassination of a progressive leader. This international solidarity represents a new phase in Pan-African consciousness, where attempts to eliminate visionary leaders will be met with widespread resistance. It also did not help that the military government of Burkina Faso reported shortly before the demonstrations that a major plot to overthrow Traore had been foiled. This has led to whispers that some foreign groups are plotting to depose Traore as a result of his anti-Western initiatives. What makes Traore particularly threatening to Western interests is his part in a broader regional shift. Along with Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso has formed the Alliance of Sahel States, representing a significant challenge to French influence in West Africa. These countries are asserting their right to determine their own futures, choose their own trading partners, and retain the benefits of their natural wealth for their own people. This movement echoes Kwame Nkrumah's vision of a united, self-sufficient Africa that can negotiate with global powers on equal terms. Captain Ibrahim Traore is no longer just the leader of a small, landlocked West African nation. For some, he has become a symbol of resistance, independence, and Pan-African pride. Whether he is remembered as a liberator or a controversial figure will depend on how the tides of history unfold. But one thing is certain. Traore's actions, as presently constructed, have sparked a continental conversation and possibly a movement.